Las Vegas. Early 1960s. A packed room that believes it has already seen the best part of the night. The applause is still standing when Dean Martin finishes the number. It rolls over him in waves, loud, practiced, confident. He steps toward the microphone, the familiar half-smile forming, ready to release the room with a line they'll take home and repeat. Then a voice cuts through the noise. Not drunk. Not playful. Sharp. Intentional. Bring Jerry back. Laughter stumbles and dies mid-breath. A few people freeze. Others glance sideways, measuring the damage. Everyone understands what was just done. That name isn't nostalgia here, it's a challenge. Dean doesn't smile. He doesn't answer. He simply stands there, letting the silence stretch until it becomes uncomfortable to breathe inside it. The band doesn't move. The room doesn't know whether it's still a show. In that pause, something shifts. This isn't about a heckler anymore. It's about whether a man is allowed to outgrow the version of himself the audience refuses to release. And everyone in the room knows, whatever Dean does next will decide more than the night. Let us know where you're watching from, and we hope you enjoy the story. The room is full before the lights dim. Not loud yet, not restless, just that dense, expectant quiet that only exists when people believe they already know what they're about to see. Las Vegas has trained audiences like this. They come carrying memories as much as tickets. Dean Martin steps into the light the way he always does, unhurried, jacket settled perfectly on his shoulders, posture relaxed enough to look careless. The band waits. Someone coughs. Glasses clink softly at the back of the room. It looks like the beginning of another familiar night. But familiarity is deceptive. For years, the name Jerry Lewis has lived in these rooms like an uninvited echo. It doesn't need to be spoken to be present. Everyone knows the story, or at least the version they prefer to remember. The duo that burned too brightly. The split in 1956 that felt less like a professional decision and more like a public divorce. One man branded the comic engine, the other reduced, unfairly, persistently, to the smooth accessory. Dean knows exactly who is sitting out there tonight. People who watched him sing alone through the 60s and still waited for a punchline that never came. People who clapped for his records but secretly wondered if the real magic had already passed. And people who came hoping, irrationally, that time might fold back on itself for their sake. He adjusts the microphone. The gesture is small, precise. The orchestra lifts into the opening bars. Then it happens. Bring Jerry back. The words cut cleanly through the music. Not slurred. Not playful. Loud enough to land, sharp enough to be intentional. It isn't the first time Dean has heard it. That's what makes it worse. He's heard it shouted from balconies, muttered near exits, thrown like a dare during talk shows. But never here. Not tonight. Not with this tone, less nostalgic than accusatory, as if the years since the split were a delay Dean still owed an explanation for. The band falters. A single beat collapses, then another. The music doesn't stop so much as lose its certainty. Laughter ripples from one side of the room, thin, reflexive, unsure of itself. Somewhere else, no one reacts at all. Faces freeze in that uncomfortable half-awareness people wear when they sense they've crossed from entertainment into something more exposed. Dean doesn't turn toward the voice. He doesn't smile either. He stands still, eyes forward, letting the silence expand. It presses outward, filling the gaps between tables, climbing the walls, settling into the balconies. The audience feels it before they understand it. This is not a moment that will be smoothed over. Every instinct in the room leans toward him now. Toward a joke. A deflection. A line sharp enough to draw applause and close the wound. That's what they expect. That's what would make this easy. But Dean remains where he is, hands resting lightly at his sides. He knows what that shout represents. Not loyalty. Not even affection. It's a test of whether he is still allowed to stand here alone. The orchestra watches him, waiting for permission to breathe again. The audience watches too, measuring him against a past they refuse to release. And in that quiet, heavier than the music that preceded it, the truth becomes unavoidable. This wasn't just a fan calling out a name. It was the room asking whether Dean Martin still belongs to himself. Dean doesn't move. Not because he's frozen, but because movement, right now, would be a concession. The pause stretches long enough for the room to grow uneasy, and in that unease his thoughts sharpen instead of scatter. He has learned this control the hard way. Long before solo records, before sold-out rooms carried his name alone, before critics stopped using the word partner when they wrote about him. On stage he is ease itself, behind the eyes, discipline holds everything in place. He doesn't need to remind himself of that. It's already there, steady as breath. What comes to him now isn't applause or headlines. It's a smaller, quieter memory, a dressing room years ago, stripped of ceremony. No shouting. No dramatic exit. Just a moment when he realized that continuing would cost more than leaving. The decision wasn't fueled by anger. It was fueled by clarity, and by a knowledge that once spoken, it couldn't be taken back. He doesn't replay the fight because there wasn't one. That's what people never understood. They wanted noise, blame, a villain to assign intelligence to and another to charm. Instead there had been silence, and then distance, and then work. Years of it. The man standing on this stage now has lived inside that silence. He's learned how easily it gets misread as weakness. From the edge of the lights he notices faces he hasn't seen much of before, men and women younger than the usual crowd. They know the name Jerry Lewis from reruns and stories filtered through someone else's nostalgia. To them, Dean Martin is not half of anything. Or at least, he wants to believe that. Tonight will tell him whether that belief can hold. He understands the trap clearly. A sharp remark would land. The room would laugh, relieved, grateful to return to something familiar. A sentimental nod would earn warmth, even applause. Either choice would tighten the old frame around him, fixing him once again inside a past he chose to leave without bitterness. That's the real risk. Not embarrassment. Not insult. But being pulled backward by expectation. The silence deepens, and with it his resolve. This pause isn't accidental, it's a line he's drawing. He lets the weight sit where it is, lets the audience feel the cost of having spoken. Control doesn't require volume. Sometimes it requires endurance. He shifts his gaze slightly, not toward the voice, but across the room, taking in the full shape of it. The tables. The lights. The orchestra waiting on his breath. This is his present, earned piece by piece, night after night, without shortcuts. Whatever he says next will define the space he stands in. And he knows, with absolute certainty, that defending himself would be a loss, even if he won the laugh. So he waits. Not out of hesitation, but out of principle. The calm on his face isn't performance. It's the discipline of a man who understands that the strongest response is often the one that refuses to compete. Dean finally lifts his hand. It's not sharp enough to command, not high enough to silence. The gesture is almost courteous, palm open, fingers relaxed, the kind of motion used to acknowledge someone across a room rather than control them. It confuses the instinct of the audience. They were ready to be corrected or entertained. This is neither. He leans slightly toward the microphone. Not close enough to perform intimacy, not far enough to distance himself. His voice, when it comes, is level, unforced, unhurried, absent of polish. He doesn't start with a joke. That alone unsettles the room. He speaks as if continuing a conversation that never broke, as if the interruption were simply another sound that passed through the air. There is no edge in his tone, no softening either. He acknowledges a name everyone knows without leaning on it, without dressing it in memory or grievance. The recognition is clean, brief, and complete, like closing a door without slamming it. What he does next is what no one expects. He doesn't pivot backward. He doesn't offer context, or history, or explanation. He doesn't invite nostalgia onto the stage. Instead, he speaks of the night as it is now, the people present, the music prepared, the fact that time has moved whether anyone approved of it or not. His words aren't poetic. They don't need to be. Their weight comes from restraint. There's a shift in the room that can't be measured in sound. Laughter doesn't arrive to rescue anyone. Applause doesn't interrupt. The audience listens in a way they hadn't planned to, caught off balance by the absence of theatrics. The man who shouted isn't addressed directly. That omission matters. Without confrontation, the provocation loses shape. There's nothing for it to push against. No duel. No spectacle. Just a quiet refusal to be repositioned. Dean's voice stays even as he redirects the night forward. Not by declaration, but by decision. He finishes speaking without punctuation, no pause to let the line settle, no invitation for approval. He steps back half a pace. The orchestra hesitates for a fraction of a second, unsure which cue they've been given. Then he gives it to them, not with a look of command, but with the smallest nod, almost a courtesy. The first notes come in softly, deliberately chosen. Not a signature hit. Not a memory trigger. Something present. Something grounded. That's when it lands. This was never about defending the past. And it isn't about reconciliation either. The room begins to understand, slowly, that what they just witnessed wasn't a response, it was a boundary. Calmly placed. Impossible to miss. Dean doesn't look relieved. He doesn't look triumphant. He looks settled, as if he's finally standing in a space that no longer requires explanation. The music carries forward, but the atmosphere has changed. The air feels tighter, more attentive. For the first time that night, the audience isn't waiting for what he'll say next. They're listening to who he is now. The silence doesn't break when the music begins. It transforms. What should have been a release settles instead into something heavier, more deliberate. The opening bars are quiet enough that people lean forward without realizing it. No one claps. No one laughs. The usual rhythm of a Vegas room, reaction on cue, comfort and familiarity, fails to reassert itself. Dean lets it happen. He doesn't offer a bridge back to safety. No quip to signal that the moment has passed, no wink to reassure anyone that this is still entertainment. He stands inside the tension and allows it to breathe. That choice unsettles the crowd more than the shout ever did. At the tables closest to the stage, older couples exchange brief glances. They remember the early years too well to mistake what they're seeing. This isn't a stumble. It's a shift. A few rows back, younger faces remain still, eyes fixed, absorbing a version of him they didn't expect, unprotected, yet unexposed. The staff hesitates along the aisles. Glasses remain unfilled. Movement feels intrusive now, as though the room has quietly agreed to suspend its habits. Dean sings without leaning into memory. The song isn't tied to shared laughter or old associations. It asks for attention rather than recognition. His phrasing is restrained, almost conversational, and it draws the focus inward. The performance doesn't reach outward for approval. It assumes presence. Applause arrives late, uncertain, scattered. Some hands rise and stop again, unsure whether they're interrupting something unfinished. Others remain still, not out of resistance, but out of respect. The absence of a unified response speaks louder than enthusiasm ever could. The person who shouted has lost the floor entirely. There is no echo, no second voice to turn a lone provocation into a movement. Whatever control they thought they had vanishes in the shared awareness that the room has moved on without them. Dean doesn't acknowledge the imbalance. He doesn't glance toward the disruption, doesn't adjust his posture to compensate. Between songs, he says very little, just enough to signal continuity, not comfort. The set unfolds with intention, each choice reinforcing the same quiet message: this evening belongs to the present tense. The orchestra follows him closely now, attuned to the new register of the night. Tempos soften. Transitions stretch. The space between notes carries as much meaning as the notes themselves. By the middle of the set, something irreversible has taken hold. The audience isn't watching a performance anymore. They're participating in a recalibration, one that strips away the expectation of payoff. There is no moment coming that will tie everything neatly together. And that's what stays with them. When the lights shift and the final song of the set approaches, the room feels altered, not subdued, but awake. Dean finishes without embellishment. No flourish. No pause for reaction. Just a clean ending, placed where it belongs. For a few seconds, no one knows whether the night has moved forward or ended altogether. That uncertainty is the point. Backstage doesn't applaud. The corridor behind the stage absorbs sound differently, carpeted, narrow, functional. The door closes, and with it the last trace of the room's tension fades into something quieter, more practical. Jackets come off. Instruments are lowered. The night resumes its ordinary pace, but not without consequence. Dean moves through it without ceremony. No entourage gathers. No one rushes him with praise or concern. That, too, is intentional. He has trained the people around him to understand when silence is preferable to reaction. In a small room off to the side, his manager waits. Not angry. Not impressed. Thoughtful, which is worse. The door shuts. The space between them fills with what could have been said but isn't. You could have leaned into that, the manager finally says. Not accusing. Observational. People were ready. They would have followed you anywhere for 5 minutes. Dean loosens his tie, slow, methodical. He doesn't sit right away. I know, he answers. No defensiveness. Just fact. There's an unspoken list between them, press calls that won't be made, headlines that won't be fed, a narrative the industry was prepared to inflate. Conflict sells cleanly when it's shaped right. Nostalgia sells even cleaner. You don't want to address it at all, the manager asks. Not even once. Dean considers the question longer than it requires. He's not weighing risk. He's confirming a boundary. No, he says. And that's the end of it. This isn't the first time the past has tried to re-enter through a side door. There were other nights, other cities, other voices that thought invoking an old name might draw something out of him. In those moments, he deflected. Smoothed. Redirected. Tonight was different because he didn't redirect at all. A producer pokes his head in briefly, floats an idea almost apologetically, nothing formal, nothing binding. A shared appearance someday. A suggestion, not a plan. Dean doesn't bristle. He doesn't negotiate. He declines with the same calm he used on stage. Later, when the building thins out and the noise drains from the hallways, Dean returns to the stage alone. Not for reflection. Not for drama. Just to collect what's his. The lights are half down now. The room looks smaller without its witnesses. He stands where he stood earlier, the exact spot, and lets the quiet settle without interpreting it. There's no satisfaction in what he did. No regret either. Just alignment. What he understands, what the industry always forgets, is that refusing to use a moment can be more decisive than exploiting it. Tonight wasn't about proving independence. It was about practicing it. When he leaves, he doesn't look back. There's nothing behind him that requires review. And somewhere beyond the walls of the theater, without a single statement issued or explanation offered, the perception begins to shift, not because it was announced, but because it was enforced. The effect doesn't announce itself. It spreads quietly, the way real changes do, noticed only after routine fails to return. The next shows feel different from the first note. Not softer, not louder. Simply more attentive. The pauses between songs no longer buzz with anticipation of interruption. No one tests the room by throwing a name into the dark. The air holds, listens. When applause comes, it's slower, heavier, as if people are considering what they're responding to. Dean notices it immediately. He says nothing about it. Adjustment is easier when it isn't discussed. Backstage conversations change tone as well. Other performers mention the night in passing, never directly. Not gossip, recognition. The kind exchanged between professionals who understand what restraint costs. The story circulates without drama, stripped of exaggeration. No quotes. No punchlines. Just the fact that something was handled, and handled cleanly. Then, through channels that never touch the press, a message moves. It doesn't come as a call. There's no request for a meeting, no suggestion of reconciliation, no emotional overture. Instead, it arrives the way matters between adults often do, indirectly, almost administratively. A comment passed through a mutual contact. A brief acknowledgement relayed without emphasis. He saw it. That's all. No praise. No challenge. No invitation to reopen anything that was closed decades earlier. Just confirmation that the moment landed where it was meant to. Dean receives the information without visible reaction. He doesn't ask follow-up questions. He doesn't respond in kind. To do so would tilt the balance, imply a need for symmetry. He understands something fundamental has already occurred, recognition without negotiation. What matters isn't that the message came. It's that it didn't demand anything. For years, the narrative required tension, either rivalry or reunion. Two options, endlessly recycled. What happened instead doesn't fit either. It's quieter. Final without being dramatic. On stage, Dean continues exactly as before. Same pacing. Same control. If anything, he speaks even less between numbers. The songs carry the weight now, chosen with care, unburdened by explanation. The audience follows without prompting. There is a sense, subtle but persistent, that an old question has been answered, not verbally, but structurally. No one asks anymore where the other half is. The absence has lost its pull. Dean understands why. The past stops intruding once it's met without resistance. When he leaves a venue one night, a younger performer nods at him in passing. Nothing more. No comment. No reference. Just acknowledgement, of autonomy, of boundaries held. That is the true echo of the moment weeks earlier. Not closure. Not peace. But mutual distance, finally respected. And for the first time in years, the silence surrounding that old name feels complete. Another city. Another room shaped by anticipation rather than memory. The marquee carries his name alone, clean and uncomplicated, and the crowd gathers without the familiar undercurrent of speculation. If anyone has come hoping for provocation, they keep it to themselves. Dean senses it before the lights come up. Not tension, absence. The kind that feels intentional. He walks on stage to steady applause, acknowledges it with a brief nod, and goes straight to the music. No preamble. No soft opening. The set unfolds with the same quiet authority he's carried for weeks now, each song placed with care, each pause allowed to exist without explanation. Somewhere in the room, someone waits. There's always been someone who believed the night could still be redirected with a single phrase. That expectation lingers like a habit, not a desire. Dean feels it pass through the room midway through the set, a collective intake of breath, a subtle tightening, as if the audience itself is bracing for an echo of the past. But it never comes. No voice rises. No name is thrown forward to test him. The moment dissolves on its own, unnoticed by most, but unmistakable to him. The absence is so complete it almost startles. The performance continues uninterrupted. Dean doesn't react to the silence because there is nothing to react to. The band follows him effortlessly. The room listens without conditions. By the final number, the atmosphere has settled into something deeper than approval. There's no sense of witnessing a confrontation resolved, no satisfaction of drama concluded. Instead, there is clarity, quiet, unforced, undeniable. He finishes the song without holding the last note longer than necessary. No theatrical pause. No glance outward to measure the response. The applause arrives anyway, full and sustained, but he doesn't wait for it to crest. Dean steps back from the microphone. He gives a small nod to the orchestra. Turns. Walks off. No encore. No commentary. No sealing gesture to mark significance. For a moment after he disappears, the room remains still. Not confused. Not disappointed. Just aware that something has ended without being announced as an ending. Only later does it register, slowly, personally, for those who remember the shout from weeks before. That phrase, once so loaded, has lost its weight not because it was answered, but because it no longer applies. What they thought was a demand had been a last attempt to anchor him to a version of himself that no longer existed. And what he offered in return wasn't rebuttal, reconciliation, or triumph. It was continuity. Dean doesn't revisit the moment. There's nothing to revisit. He goes on working, performing, choosing the present again and again without framing it as a statement. And that is what endures. Not the silence in the room when the shout failed to appear, but the understanding that followed it. He didn't bring anything back. He moved forward. And the world, finally, let him.